said before, welcome on behalf of the CAF Red Tail Squadron. I want to thank you for joining us. We're recording this program on February 1st, 2012. I'm Stan Ross, your moderator. So we would like you to kindly take a moment and get a pencil and paper so that you can make notes and invite your friends, family, and other history buffs to join us as we begin a webinar and live broadcast talking to a couple of original Tuskegee Airmen. The topic of tonight's broadcast is going to be reflecting on the accuracy of the recent George Lucas film, Red Tail. Joining us tonight are Colonel Charles McGee and Colonel Harold Brown, both original Tuskegee Airmen. Colonel McGee was born in Cleveland, Ohio, and spent his childhood there and in Illinois and Iowa. And he was commissioned a second lieutenant and graduated from class 43F at Tuskegee Army Airfield. Colonel McGee remained on duty for 30 years and became a command pilot with over 6,100 total time in the air and flew a variety of fighter aircraft. His World War II experience was with the 302nd Fighter Squadron, and coincidentally they were based in Italy during World War II, which ostensibly is the background for the film, The Red Tails. Colonel Harold Brown is from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and was a member of the 332nd Fighter Group. Colonel Brown has the distinction of having completed 30 missions before being shot down and held as a POW in Germany. I am tremendously excited to be able to get his reflections on that element of his service. And we're going to start the questioning off, if we can, with Colonel McGee. Could you kindly give us your reflections, sir, on your view of the accuracy of the Red Tails film? And Colonel McGee, are you with us right now? And let's switch over to Harold Brown. And Harold, can you hear me here?
Yes, sir. Loud and clear.
Fantastic. Perhaps while we're getting Charles' audio connection worked out, if you would kindly give us your reflections on the accuracy of the Red Tails film.
Well, first, as you know, this is not a documentary. This was a movie. And even though in the movie, if you remember the original credits, I believe it stated something like the movie was taken from true facts or else true stories, something to that effect. So even though it was taken from a series of true facts, the question still becomes, how do you present those true facts? For example, if they told me or I told them that I dove down on an ME-262, there are many ways that the director could present that. And he could present it in such a way so that it could either be the greatest thing in the world or it could be nothing but just a very average thing in the world. So I think you have to keep that in mind, the fact that the producer and also the director of the films, they did take a number of liberties. But remember, this is an action movie.
Absolutely.
And everybody expected it to be extremely exciting, and it was extremely exciting.
In fact,
and even some of the things pretty much approximated some of the events, they were most certainly embellished by the producer, and he made it very, very exciting. So, and overall, in looking at the film, yep, it was very entertaining, but that's what it was.
Fantastic. One of our early visitors to the webinar here is Teresa Barta, who wants to know one of the characters in the movie was captured and later escaped from a Nazi prison camp. And Teresa, you'll be happy to know you're listening to Colonel Harold Brown, who actually lived that. Colonel Brown, can you tell us a little bit about what that episode in the war was like, from the moment you knew your airplane was no longer flyable to your early experiences in prison and how you came up with the idea to get out?
Well, first, I did not escape, and I didn't even attempt to escape. But I was on a strafing mission, and my aircraft was heavily damaged while on the strafing mission, and it only ran for another 2 to 3 minutes. And I just did have enough time to gain a little altitude, 1,200 feet or so, and then I lost all of my coolant. And of course, once you lose coolant with that inline engine, it immediately freezes up on you. So I rolled it over, jettisoned the canopy, and popped the stick forward, which threw me out. I pulled the chute almost immediately because I knew I didn't have that much altitude to play with. And fortunately, the chute opened, and I landed in snow up to my knees almost. Now, I knew that if I could just evade for about 6 or 7 days, if I could be that fortunate, then I could almost reach the Russian line. But as fate would have it, up over the hill comes a couple of constables with on skis and rifles, and they pointed the rifles down at me, at which time I threw my hands up in the air, and they then led me back to the little village. Now, the little village that they led me back to was one of the places that we had just hit, because we had been strafing about 100-mile corridor all the way from Linz, Austria, southwest, just about 100 miles. And this little village was all the way down on the southeastern tip, just about 100 miles or so from Linz, Austria. And they led me back in. Well, you can imagine if guys have been strafing your little village, and even though they are strafing railroad traffic, engines are blowing up all over the place, shrapnel's flying all over the place, and if a piece of shrapnel happens to hit your mother and kills her, or hits your wife or your little baby, you're going to be a very, very upset young man. So that's what I was met with, a mob of about 25 to 30 people who were extremely angry. Well, long story short, they finally decided, or at least I felt, that they were just going to hang me. And it just so happened there was, as I referred to it, as the perfect lynching tree. It had a limb that went out at just the right height, and it was just an ideal place and an ideal time to have a lynching. And that's what I actually thought was going to happen. Well, it didn't quite happen. There was another older man, a constable on the other side, who slowly walked around, and I completely ignored him until all of a sudden I felt a hand on my shoulder, and he stepped in front of me, and he put his rifle on the villagers and held them at bay. Of course, I didn't speak German, but it was obvious from the way they were hollering and screaming at each other that they weren't in all agreement with him. But nevertheless, he held them off of me. We backed up about a couple of blocks to a little pub. We went into the pub, barricaded ourselves in there, and well, before that, we threw everybody out, and we barricaded ourselves in the little pub. And we stayed there until just about midnight. But the interesting thing about that is this. That constable probably has been there. He looked to be about 35, 40 years old, which means that he knew everybody that was probably in that mob. And some of the people were probably very, very dear friends of his. But yet and still, he held that rifle on him and would not let those villagers touch me. And I often wonder what in the world happened to that guy later on. I would like to believe that, you know, the next day the villagers had cooler heads and was not too angry at him at what he did. But I say that only to say that I should have taken the time to go back at some later time in my life, find the guy, and thank him for saving my life. But I didn't do it.
Well, it may not be too late for that. One of our
Yeah, and there's nothing, of course, I will regret that until the day I die, but nevertheless, that's what I should have done. But I got home, I was only 20 years old, and going back to Germany was the last thing on my mind. But as I got older and older, I did think about it. But it's funny.
I appreciate that. One of the questions just coming in is from Jordan Lyles, who asks, was the city destroyed during your mission over it?
What was the what?
Was the city destroyed? How heavily damaged was the city during that strafing run?
Oh, this was nothing but just a little village, and it just so happens that the railroad tracks went through this village, and there happened to be a lot of railroad traffic that was parked right at the village at that moment, and that's the only reason why we were strafing near that village. But that was nothing but just a little village, nothing more than that. And so from that point on, it was just a matter of getting into a POW camp. I wound up with a bomber crew who went down a few days after they caught me. So they had the bomber crew and myself, 11 of us, and it took us just about 10 days to get to Nuremberg, where the interrogation center was at. And interesting enough, we traveled any way that anything became available. We would jump on a bus, take a bus for maybe 15, 20 miles or so. We got on a train at one time, and that was the most horrible experience I ever had. Now I know what it was to be on a train. We looked up and saw 4 P-51s coming down to strafe the train, and that was the most frightening thing I think I have ever experienced in my life, because you could hear bullets flying all around the place. Everybody had ducked underneath seats as if that would give us any protection, and we was hoping that the old engineer would get to the first tunnel before the P-51s got the train, and he did. So that's the only thing that caused the P-51s to break off after he made it to the tunnel. But that was a horrible experience. And now I knew what it felt like to be on the other end, with someone shooting at me rather than me shooting at them. But after I got to Nuremberg. Now, Nuremberg, a very large city, it was completely bombed out. There wasn't a building standing in Nuremberg. Nothing was standing except for one structure. And as you looked up in the north, you could see this one structure up on the horizon, and I'll give you one guess as to what it was. And this was in Nuremberg. What do you think that structure was?
Hesitant to guess, sir.
Okay, then if no one is guessing, let me tell you. Remember when Jesse Owens won those 4 gold medals in Nuremberg at the 1936 Olympics?
Yes.
The British was systematically bombing out Nuremberg, but they would not touch that stadium, and they left that stadium standing.
Wow, now there's a testament. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
We're getting lots and lots of questions from our viewers right now. We're going to try and get to every one of them, but it is obvious that we're going to be inundated here.
Well, I can keep going, or you can throw out a question or whatever. Let me just say a few things more. We only stayed in Nuremberg for just a very short time, and the Americans were advancing. So they decided to take the 10,000 prisoners in Nuremberg and march them down to Moosburg. And it took us 2 weeks to walk down there. And that is where we were then interned. They already had 15,000 in Moosburg. And Moosburg's about, 20, 25 kilometers north of Munich, Germany. And that is where the camp, Moosburg Patton came through on April the 29th and liberated us prisoners there at Moosburg. And he hollered at us and talked about that he would be in Berlin within the next 2 or 3 days, and he was going to find the paper hanger and what he was going to do to the paper hanger once he found them. And that was rather amusing.
Very, very interesting.
Yeah. So questions, whatnot.
We can get Colonel McGee a few minutes to reflect on some of the other questions that are coming up. And by all means, while Colonel McGee is chatting, Harold, if you can take a look at some of the questions that are on the chat line here. Colonel McGee, one of the questions from Virgil Reynes asks, with all the racial tension, did you ever, during takeoff, wonder about aircraft tampering? Colonel McGee, could you reflect on that a little bit and then go into a little bit of your reflections on the Red Tails film? Apparently we're still having some connection issues with Colonel Charles McGee, and we're working to get those resolved. And while we do, let's go back to Harold Brown. And Harold, could you answer that question? With the racial tension, did you ever have any concerns during takeoff about your aircraft being tampered with?
No, not at all. That was probably the very, very last thing on my mind. And I don't think I can ever remember a time of even having the slightest reflections on such a thing. You see, you have to remember now, we were all Afro-Americans there. And that was it. It was a totally segregated base. And I'm certain that one of the brothers wouldn't tamper with my airplane. And there were no other folks on that base except us. And we had perimeter guards, everything. So I just can't, no. Never for a moment did I ever feel any apprehensiveness about someone tampering with the aircraft.
That's reassuring. Russell Morrison writes in, did the Tuskegee Airmen fighter squadrons actually shoot down any of the German jet fighters? And we both know that that's affirmative.
Yes, they did. Absolutely.
Can you reflect, did you encounter any, Colonel Brown?
Well, it just so happens that I did. It was on my 12th mission. That was December the 12th. If you go back to the archives, they talk about the mission of December 12th, and there were two pilots missing in action. One was Lieutenant Harold H. Brown, and the other one was a lieutenant, and I'll think of his name in just a minute here. Daniel Rich was his name. And we were both missing in action. We never got back from that mission. Now, let me tell you the rest of the story and why we didn't get back to the base. We were protecting the bombers up around Blechheimer, which is in the northern part of Germany, and we have seen ME-262s, dance around and play around off in the distance, and they would faint coming in, but they never would come in. And we saw them on several occasions. On this day, there were 2 flights of 4 of them. And they kept dancing around, and finally they turned towards the bombers, and Major Campbell, who was leading the squadron, said, I think they're coming in this time. And I was in the lead flight with him. So we jettisoned our tanks, and 2 of them came right below us, and when they did, Rich, who was my wingman, and we peeled off right down on top of him. And, of course, he saw us, and he immediately went into a dive, and we followed him. Now, the interesting thing is this. Now, as long as he stayed in that dive, he was not separating himself from us that fast. And all the guy had to do was just level off, and he would go 500 miles an hour, and we had maximum speed to get maybe 30 plus miles out of our ships, and he would immediately separate himself from us. But he didn't do that, and I thought that was so dumb. He stayed in the dive, and he was subsonic. He had a subsonic wing, a thick wing on it, and he was not separating. But he was out of range, and I had him in my gun sight. We both had him in our gun sight. So I hollered at Rich, well, just shoot, and maybe we might get in a lucky shot. Well, we started at 30,000 feet, and we went all the way down to the deck, and when he went level, he immediately separated himself from us. He led us over a flak trap and everything. they threw up everything at us, including the kitchen sink. We immediately broke away from it and started heading back home. And then Rich and I got separated as we climbed through the clouds to get back up to altitude. And I knew that we had gotten quite a ways west, and I wasn't certain about where my position was at. So I just picked up a heading of due south, because I know due south would lead me back into northern Italy. But Rich, in the meantime, was calling me, saying, Harold, I got a heading, and such, and he was giving me the heading, but I wasn't receiving it. My radios had been knocked out, which I didn't know at the time. So Rich used that heading and got back to a base. I just flew due south until I knew I was over northern Italy, but then I started losing my fuel, and I finally had fuel exhaustion. So here I am at about 20,000 feet, fuel exhausted, no engine. So I was dead stick, and I brought it all the way down, and I said, well, I'll wait until I get down to about 10,000 feet, and I'll go on and jump out of the aircraft. Well, at 10,000 feet, I got down at that altitude, and I saw an old abandoned fighter strip. So I said, well, I got it made. I can land on that fighter strip, go out to the nearest road, flag down an old Army truck, and have him, hey, bring me up some fuel, and I'll be on my way home in about an hour or so. But as I got closer to the strip had been made unusable, and they would do that by right in the center of the strip. They would dig about a 10-foot wide ditch about 4 or 5 feet deep. So the whole strip was less than 4,000 feet. This means that with the big ditch there, I had 2,000 feet on one side, crossed the ditch, and about 2,000 feet on the other side. Well, that would have been tough even if I had an engine going, but here I am dead stick, and coming in on the final on that thing, you know, you're sitting there, well, I'm a little high, so I can't make the first 2,000. I'll have to stretch it to the second 2,000. Then, no, I can't make the second 2,000. I better take it in at the first 2,000. Now, this is all happening in terms of microseconds. All these things are flashing through your mind. In the meantime, this thing is sitting like a rock, so I just slammed the thing on the ground during the first 2,000 feet, and it, you know, scooted up to the ditch, hit the ditch. It teetered all the way up, so it was standing up on its nose, and but it fell back on its belly, which I was very thankful for, because I thought there might be some residual fuel in there. And if that fuel got close to that hot engine, there might have been an explosion. But it settled back, and when it did, I jumped out of the aircraft and dusted off my uniform. And you know the old adage, if you can walk away from it, it's a good landing.
Absolutely, and it sounds like you made an excellent one in that situation. We're going to give you a moment to get a drink of water. Hopefully we'll have Charles McGee back when we return. We're going to take just a moment now to review a couple of these questions, and I'll try to answer some of the ones that I can on my own. But in the meantime, I'd like to remind the audience to please reach out to your friends and family and affiliates and invite them to join us on this webinar tonight. And also remember, we have another one coming up on February 4th. And more information about these webinars is available on our website, redtail.org. Of course, the mission of the Red Tail Project is to carry the lessons and legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen into every classroom in America and beyond. And the reason we're hosting this webinar presentation tonight is to invite you all to help participate in that and help us reach our goal of carrying this message forward. In order to do that, you can text Red Tail on your cell phone, Red Tail, to 20222, and that will result in a donation of $10, which will appear on your cell phone bill. Text donations are going to receive a free gift, and we invite you to participate in that small way if you appreciate what we're doing here. The key word is Red Tail, R-E-D-T-A-I-L, to 20222. A $10 donation there, and messaging and data rates may apply. There'll be a couple of other opportunities for you to support our educational mission as well, and by all means, we invite you to do that as well. Let's see, a message here from Frank. Can you, Colonel Brown, if you're with us, can you kindly describe the circumstances of meeting your brother Larry during the war when he served in the Army?
Oh, okay, that's interesting. Who in the world asked that question?
All I see is Frank, and Frank, if you could send in your full name and your city, I'd like to recognize that. Noel is the name. Thank you, Frank, and he wants to know about your experience meeting your own brother during the war.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. My brother was 5 years my senior. And if anybody who's ever had an older brother about 5 or 6 years older than he is knows what a horrible relationship that exists between the two of you. Ma would say, okay, Lawrence, if you're going, you got to take Harold with you. And he would say, oh, Ma, do I have to drag him along with me? And she'd say, yep. If you don't drag him along, then you can't go. So we would go off and leave. And I am walking 4 or 5 spaces behind, and he's screaming at me, come on, keep up, keep up. So you can imagine what the relationship was. Well, in June 1942, when I came out of high school, he had just received his draft notice, and he went into the draft. And I was the happiest man in the world to see him out of my hair. And I immediately walked into the closet and took all of his clothes, because they fit me just great. Now, that was June of 1942. He went over to Africa. He was in the North American campaign, from there up into Sicily, on up into southern Italy, and then on up Italy towards the Po Valley. So let's go ahead from that June 42, when he went in, all the way up until February of 1945. We never wrote to each other. However, he had a dear friend who was a captain, and he was our armament officer for the 332nd Fighter Group. And they were old buddies, and he was from Minneapolis also. He was Captain Henry Bowman from Southside Minneapolis. Well, they were old buddies, and they kept in touch with each other. But what I didn't know is Bubba was asking Bowman, well, how is Harold doing? How is Harold doing? So this is how he kept up with me. Then the latter part of February, he decided he got some time off, so he was hitchhiking to come down to see me. And there were 12 of them on a truck. The truck goes off the bridge down into a creek. 4 guys were killed, 4 were thrown out of the truck, and the truck landed on the other 4. And my brother was one of those 4 that the truck landed on top of. The very next morning, I get a call from the 4th Field Hospital, which was right next door, and they said, will you come over and identify Staff Sergeant Brown? And I thought, oh, my God, they used the word identify. I said, my God, is the guy dead? So I jump in the Jeep, run over there, and told them, hey, I'm Lieutenant Brown and Staff Sergeant Brown. They directed me to where he was staying, and I went in and I looked at him, and he was a mess. He was almost unrecognizable. So he looked at me and he said, Harold, is that you? I said, yeah, Bubba. And I always called my brother Lawrence Bubba all of my life. So he says, is that you, Harold? I said, yeah, Bubba. And he says, Harold, will you brush my teeth? That was the first thing he said. He was a fanatic about his teeth, and the first thing he asked me to do was to brush his teeth. And that's how we first met after almost 3 years, hadn't written each other, hadn't seen each other, you name it.
That is amazing, and he does have a textbook, picture-perfect smile. We know Bubba's relaxing at home tonight with his feet up, just taking it easy after little bit of a challenge, and we want to send him our best wishes. And the
and let me just add a couple things to it.
Okay.
I saw him that day. The next day, I went on R&R on rest and recuperation to a hotel down in Naples. I came back after a week, and they had already wired the folks saying your son is critically ill, and yakety yak. I went back in the very next day and said, Bubba, I got to fly a mission today, but I'll be right back in after the mission's over. That's the mission that I got shot down on. So then the folks get another telegram right after that saying, we're sorry to inform you, but your son, Harold H. Brown, is missing in action.
Oh, man.
So
I think for parents to go through, I know the anxiety of parents, and we can all reflect on that, those of us who have children who serve in the military today, how anxious it is when our kids and our loved ones, family members, are off in a foreign country fighting a war. And we can certainly respect the anxiety your parents must have had during these challenging times. One of the interesting things I've noticed through the years of getting to know you and the other Tuskegee Airmen is how influential your post-war activities have been on the world, and your entire family, including Bubba, have been very, very proactive in the community. And I think one of Bubba's greatest contributions has been a participant in organizing the Ronald McDonald House nationwide, and many, many other activities. So hats off to your brother, your entire family, and it's pretty amazing to hear these first-person stories. We're getting lots of questions. Cheryl from San Jose asks, in your day, what was the inspiration that drove you to become a pilot?
Oh, that's easy. Initially, when I was about 5 years old, my mother looked at me, and, you know, mothers can see things that no one else can see. And she looks, and in some strange way, she saw all this great potential in me to become a pianist. And she slapped me down on a piano stool and said, you're going to be the greatest pianist player in the world. Well, that went on until I was about 11 years old, and I had a love affair with an airplane. I said, Ma, I'm going to become a military pilot. Randolph Field, West Point of the Air, United States Army Air Corps cadet. And that was my dream, and that's what I wanted to do. I made model airplanes, went through the whole routine. We had a little flying club when I was in high school at Minneapolis. But the interesting thing is this. In 1941, when they announced the first class, every one of those guys was a college graduate. Several of them had master's degree, and a couple of them had already taken their PhD exams and had done everything except to write their thesis. And this is what the Air Force wanted, college graduates. So all the people that came in 41 were all college graduates. And then when McGee and Lt came in 1942, they were still all college graduates. But when I graduated from high school in 1942, they changed the rules. And they started something called aviation student. So when I graduated from high school, I immediately went down, took the written exam, took the physical exam. All my paperwork had to go to Washington, D.C., and that's where they made the decision. Well, they finally decided on me in December of 1942, and I got a letter saying I had been selected. So from that point on, I was sent from there to Biloxi, Mississippi, then up to Tuskegee Institute, where I was an aviation student for 4 months, and then I went over to Tuskegee Army Airfield, where I became an aviation cadet. This is an amazing, amazing broadcast. We're very grateful for Colonel Harold Brown to be joining us, and we also invite Colonel Charles McGee to attempt to dial back in. We're trying to reach you on your home phone, Charles, and not having much luck. So if you're listening in, please dial back in and give us a call at any of the numbers you have for us. We'd love to have you join the conversation.
We're getting a lot of questions from both of these outstanding gentlemen, including a comment here from Washington, D.C. And if I can get the chat line to stop bouncing, I'll read it here because this is great. Paul Capel is a member of the Tuskegee Airmen Motorcycle Club in the Washington, D.C. chapter, and their shared mission, similar to the Red Tail Squadron, is Ride to Keep the Legacy Alive. And we're very honored to have you and the rest of the Tuskegee Airmen Motorcycle Club members joining us. In fact, Colonel McGee's daughter, Yvonne, is affiliated with this motorcycle club. And Yvonne, if you could kindly give Charles a call and help iron out some of the audio wrinkles we're having, we'd sure be grateful for that because we'd love to hear from him. Really appreciate the comments. Please keep them coming. And I'm going to scroll back through because there was another question I really wanted to... here's one from Kay Freedy. Did you encounter a Falk-Wolf F-190 in action? And at what point in the war did you fly the D model Mustang, Colonel Brown?
Well, I never flew the B model. As a matter of fact, the B model had very, very limited use. The aircraft that they really went with was the P-51Cs. And, of course, we have 4 fighter groups in Fighter Command in the 15th Air Force. We had 4 P-51 groups, and we had a couple of P-38 groups. But the four fighters flying P-51s only flew the P-51C models. And they only flew them for a relatively short period of time, and they start sending in the P-51Ds that had the nice bubble canopy on it. But we always felt that the C model was our signature aircraft, as we were the only ones flying them, and we flew them, oh geez, all the way up until about the latter part of 1944, November, December, before we started getting D models. And then they started feeding D models into us, and we slowly got rid of the P-51Cs.
Fantastic. There's another question from someone who I believe is really brushed up on his history. Colonel Brown and Colonel McGee have been involved with the Red Tail Squadron since the very beginning of our program to tell the Tuskegee Airmen story. And I've heard this one relayed a couple of times. Colonel Brown, maybe you could reflect on a question from Tim. Did the Tuskegee Airmen really have to steal long-range tanks from another squadron for the Berlin?
They often refer to that as the very famous midnight raid. What happened was this. You know, the 15th Air Force decided to bomb Berlin. To bomb Berlin, this was a 1,600-mile round trip, 800 miles up, 800 miles back. There's no way in the world we could have possibly done that, made that round trip for those little 75-gallon tanks, which is what we normally flew with. So we didn't have any 110-gallon tanks. Captain Henry Bowman from Minneapolis got a bunch of guys together because someone told him, hey, there are a bunch of 110-gallon tanks, but they're destined to some of the other P-51 groups in the 15th Air Force. So Hank Bowman goes out with his little mob, literally robs or steals all these 110-gallon tanks and bring them back to the base. How he got away with it, I don't know, but he pulled it off, and that's how we got at least 110-gallon tanks for this great big mission to Berlin.
How about that? To the last plane, to the last bullet, to the last opportunity to get the fuel tanks we need. The Tuskegee Airmen were resourceful beyond measure.
Can you imagine that?
I just think it's remarkable. These are the kind of stories that we are dedicated to bringing to the classrooms all over this country, and we're going to continue these webinars as long as we can. I've just gotten approval that we might be able to continue this one longer than 45 minutes, and I'm hopeful that we can get Colonel McGee to get dialed back in, and we're just going to keep on going. We're having such a great time here. Here's a question. One of the viewers has asked if there were actually gun cameras on the aircraft. Can you reflect on that, please, Colonel?
Absolutely. every aircraft also had cameras. And within your cockpit, you could go to cameras only. You could go to guns and cameras. Of course, you would have no reasons to go to cameras only. So you automatically you would hit the switch, guns and cameras. And the cameras was always on.
Fantastic. Jacob wants to know, did you have a gun that you could use even if you were not in your airplane?
A gun I could use even if I wasn't in my airplane?
Like, were you guys issued sidearms for escaping?
Oh, we all had, we always carried an Army .45 caliber gun. I mean, you know, pistol. Matter of fact, I had my gun nickel-plated, and it was gorgeous. I mean, that was a good-looking gun. But, boy, the day I was shot down and they put that rifle on me, I immediately pulled that gun out and threw it just as far as I could throw it. Because they said, hey, if you get caught, throw your gun away, because all you do is upset the people if they see you with a gun on. You know, so we would get rid of the gun. And that's what I did.
Thanks for that question, Jacob, and I want to also thank Walter Gerald for his question about the gun cameras. We're still hoping we can get Colonel McGee to get dialed back in here, so we'll be, if the panelists or the people running the switchboard down there will let me know when he gets back on, we'd sure like to get him involved. Colonel Brown, how old were you when you soloed in an airplane? What kind of plane was it, and what was it like strapping into the Mustang? This question from Clark Hatcher.
Well, when I was 16 years old, I was in the 11th grade, and I saved up $35. And I went out to the old Wold Chamberlain Field, which is now the big international airport, and that $35 got me 5 lessons. $7 dual is what I paid for that little Piper J3, the little yellow, you know, tail dragger. Now, after the 5 lessons, I didn't have any more money, so I didn't take any more lessons. So then when I graduated from high school at 17, you know that whole story that I just told, from Tuskegee and then over to Tuskegee Army Airfield, that was in August of 1944. I spent 10 weeks in Tuskegee in pre-flight. There were 4 divisions for the whole flight program. Every component was 10 weeks long. Pre-flight was 10 feet long. Primary flying 10 weeks. Basic flying 10 weeks. Advanced flying 10 weeks. That was a total of 40 weeks, and then you would graduate, you get your wings and your second lieutenant. I flew the PT-17 Stearman, the open cockpit, and I soloed that airplane in 7.5 hours.
Wow. Here's a question for Bob Ravinovitz, one of our friends in Minneapolis, asking if the P-40 was capable of turning with the ME-109 in the dogfight, or did you need to attack from a high altitude? Thanks for the question, Bob.
As a matter of fact, the P-40 was very, very maneuverable. It's just that it was so slow, and the old 40 could actually turn with that 109. But normally, what happened, it wasn't your advantage to just get in a circle with him. So normally, most of the shots that were done, either you had some altitude advantage, something, and it was the 40 diving, picking up the 109, going in on them. If the 109 saw him, one of their most favorite maneuvers was to roll it over, split F, and go right down to the deck. And they were faster than the old P-40, and they could outrun the P-40. So that was the easiest way to get away from a P-40. But you know, they didn't get too many victories with that P-40. As a matter of fact, the 99th got a total of 17 victories flying the P-40, and they were doing close tactical work, dive bombing, strafing, and whatnot, so they really didn't see that many fighters. So they didn't even have that many opportunities, really, to engage the fighters. But they flew over there. They left the States in April. It took up until June till they flew their first mission, and they flew over in Africa, Sicily, whatnot, for just about 1 year. And in June of the following year, of 1944, they were reassigned to the 332nd Fighter Group. So during that year, they got 17 victories.
How about that? That is remarkable. The entire story is remarkable. I am personally very proud to be involved with the Red Tail Squadron and very grateful for Colonel Brown and Colonel McGee's long-standing dedication and commitment to helping us help them tell their stories. We're going to take just a moment, and if I can get the director to go back to that jacket promo page, we'd sure appreciate that, because I'd like to talk a little bit about how our listeners can invite others and participate themselves in keeping this mission alive. The Red Tail Squadron is an all-volunteer driven mission of the Commemorative Air Force dedicated to telling the story of the Tuskegee Airmen, and we invite you to help us keep our story alive by participating either at the $99 level. For those of you who are on the webinar, can see this information live. An annual sponsorship of $99 gets you a subscription to the Red Tail Mail newsletter, an embroidered sponsor hat, and a copy of A-Train's book, Memoirs of a Tuskegee Airman. I was fortunate enough to get to meet A-Train a couple of times. He's a wonderful, wonderful gentleman. We miss him dearly. The Chinook package as a tribute to the Chinook Army Air Base, and it includes an embroidered leather jacket, an embroidered leather hat, and a rivet certificate signed by an original Tuskegee Airman at $375, and these donations will help us do an awful lot of legwork to keep this mission focused and get us traveling around the country to the schools as far as we can reach them. And we would like to invite you to participate in this program and join us as a donor and a volunteer. And we're going to give you a little message now, and we'll be right back.
We can get together, go out and say, hey, we're going to go down there and set the world on fire. It's more collectively individuals seeking to do their best and accomplish the mission that was assigned.
Our mission is to carry the lessons and legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen into every classroom in America.
If you believe, as we do, that this is an exciting and effective way to carry the story of the Tuskegee Airmen and the excitement of flight to young people all across America, to inspire them to realize how they can rise above the situation they find themselves in, the adversity in their lives, and become contributing members of our society, then we'd encourage you, we'd invite you to come to our website at redtail.org and learn more about what we do.
And that is the delicious, wonderful sound of a P-51 Mustang soaring across the sky. That soundtrack comes from redtail.org/exhibit. And that page on our website will talk about the Rise Above traveling exhibit that we have created through the generous sponsorship of Texas Flying Legends Museum. It's a remarkable trailer that is a rolling semi-trailer that turns into a 180-degree movie theater with 30 climate-controlled seats inside. And it is quite a remarkable opportunity for us to carry our message and the Tuskegee Airmen story, not always to airports, but to the schools that really need to hear this message to inspire the kids of today to learn from the lessons and legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen. Let's see, now Greg Mitchell wants to know if we can focus on the accuracy of the movie. And Colonel Brown, if you could give us a little more embellishment on what your thoughts are as to the accuracy of the movie.
Well, like I said earlier, this is a movie and not a documentary, and even though the story is based upon true facts, it is still pretty much the director and the producer to determine how they're going to portray those facts. And if they choose to embellish those facts, which is what they did on a number of occasions in that movie, because what we didn't want to do is to sit up there and see an old dull dog fight that didn't amount to anything. So all of the dog fights and whatnot that they had were based upon missions that were flown. Only they really had some wild dog fights going on. Now, if you remember, they have one involving the destroyer. Now, that was based upon actual facts. As a matter of fact, that was Captain Pruitt and his wingman that saw this destroyer, and they go down to strafe it, and what they did was pure unadulterated luck. They happened to hit the magazine section. And, of course, there's where all of the ammunition was stored. And that thing blew up and came right out of the water. So that was actual factual. The chances of him doing that are so remote, it isn't funny. But somebody was smiling on them, and the two of them went down, and they got a destroyer. Matter of fact, as far as I know, or at least in the 15th Air Force, we were the only fighter group to ever be given credit for destroying a destroyer aircraft. So some of those things were pretty factual. The trip to Berlin, we actually made that trip to Berlin, and we did shoot down several ME-262s, and the movie shows us doing that. However, if you also remember in that movie, the P-51 and the ME-262 were coming at each other head-on, and that was extremely exciting, but trust me, it didn't happen. Not quite like that. No one was going to go nose to nose at each other. The jet was probably going about 500, the P-51 400 plus, so that's about a 900-mile-an-hour closing speed of two airplanes approaching each other. No, that's what I mean. They embellished some of the things, but we did make the mission, and we did shoot down 3 aircraft, so to that extent, it is true. It is just that these are action movies, and no one goes to see an action movie to see a bunch of dull, movie things.
Sitting around the shack. That's not going to sell a lot of popcorn, but
that's right, and these are action movies.
I'm impressed that you think about some of the accuracies in the film. Let's see, we have a question from Dick Leininger, and he wants to know if you were in a C model Mustang when you were shot down.
Say again.
I said the question from Dick Leininger is, were you flying the P-51C when you were shot down?
Yeah, I was flying the C model that day. Matter of fact, I had A32, but I was periodically flying the D model because we had several D models in the squadron at that time. Even though we weren't fully equipped with them, and if my airplane was out of commission, then I would just fly one of the D models. But I was flying A32, which was a C model.
How about that? One of the questions here is, and this, did Captain Pruitt paint a ship silhouette on his plane after that? This question from Ed.
I don't know if he did or not, and that's a good question. McGee might know, but I can't. I just don't know the answer to that. But that's an excellent question.
Very good question, and we also have another question. As I said, we're going to be joined by viewers, young and old. This one is from 9-year-old Cade. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. He's wondering if it was hard to fly the P-51.
Well, I don't know for sure how you interpret hard. We were pilots. We were airplane pilots. That is an airplane, and we fly it. As a matter of fact, it was, as far as I was concerned, it was a fairly simple airplane to fly. It was highly maneuverable, a beautiful airplane to fly, and as far as I was concerned, it was probably, I had flown the P-40 and I had flown the P-47 before flying the P-51, and I just thought the P-51 was just a beautiful airplane to fly. I just love that airplane.
I remember I just unearthed a videotape of the very first day that the Red-tailed Mustang arrived at our home base in South St. Paul, and that day I believe you got a ride in the airplane with Don Hines. Is that correct?
Ah, how well I remember that. That was in July of 2001. If I remember correctly. It was the first week of July, because I was up there. I had been invited up to be in the parade in Edina for the 4th of July. And you and several of the other guys met me at the airport that Monday in that great big stretch limo, and we went out to Fleming Field, and there was about, 500-600 people out there, and they had the unveiling of the 51. That was a memorable day.
It was a very wonderful day for all of us, and we're so glad to have been able to share that with you. And any of the other Tuskegee Airmen listening, we'd sure like to share that experience with you and your family members as well. So if we have other Tuskegee Airmen in the audience tonight, please get in touch with us. We'd like you to participate in future webinars, and also to experience the thrill of showing your family one of the types of airplane that you had some experience in. So we're grateful for that. There's a question from Kara who wants to know, in the film, there's a scene depicting the white bomber pilots eventually inviting Tuskegee Airmen into an officer's bar for a drink while still in Europe. Did this ever happen in your experience, Harold?
As a matter of fact, it didn't happen to me personally, but it did happen to a number of the guys who happened to be on R&R over in Naples, Italy. We went on R. This is where they were going on R&R, and it was later on during the war, after they found out that us guys were flying those red tails. There was a great deal of mutual respect for us and us for them. Of course, we always admired the bomber pilots. Those are the poor guys, and once they hit the IP, it's a straight line to the target, and you don't deviate. And they would go in that great big black cloud, which was nothing but flak that they had to put up over the target. And I thought those guys had more guts than I got to go through that. So there was that mutual respect after they found out that we were the red-tailed pilots. So I would imagine, I don't know for a fact, but I would imagine there were a number of those kinds of incidents where a guy would run into a bomber pilot and whatnot. He'd invite him and, hey, come on in and have a drink with me.
Well, one of the greatest thrills I've experienced in witnessing your encounters with the air show audiences and in educational situations is when the bomber crews come up and personally thank you for saving their lives. It is really, really thrilling. I've gotten to witness that from coast to coast, and it is remarkable to envision how many lives and how many generations have been impacted, and families, entire families saved by the dedicated actions and persistence of the Tuskegee Airmen in staying with the bombers. Another question here from from Dick Leininger again. How much training were you given before you flew the P-51? And he comments that he saw Colonel Brown leap onto the wing of the P-51C that day in South St. Paul and was impressed with his athletic ability, and I share that impression. But tell us a little bit about the training you got prior to flying your first P-51.
Well, when I finished flying school, I got 20 hours. I transitioned into fighters by flying the P-40 for 20 hours. But then when I went to fighter training, I flew the P-47 Thunderbolt. And the reason being that that was the first airplane that the 332nd Fighter Group was flying when they joined the 15th Air Force. So that is what I trained in. But they only kept that P-47 for 1 month. And then they had another change of equipment. They started picking up P-51Cs. So when I got overseas, they were, all of the P-47s were gone, and everything was a P-51C. So I got the manual, read the manual and whatnot. The operation officer talked to us for about 10, 15 minutes about the characteristics of the airplane. We went down the next morning. They had several airplanes ready, and there it is. Jumped on board, got myself familiar with the cockpit, and fired her up and down the runway. Just that
incredible.
simple.
I've tried that several times with the Red Tail Squadron's P-51, and wisely, someone always stops me from actually turning the engine.
Oh, you'll make it one day.
Here's another question from Paul. Colonel Brown, were you one of the airmen in attendance at the Tuskegee Airmen Congressional Gold Medal ceremony?
Yes, sir, I was there.
Yep, that's wonderful. As many of you know, the Tuskegee Airmen were instrumental in changing the social fabric of American society, as well as integrating the military. And if you could reflect on the changes that you've witnessed since World War II to today, Colonel Brown, can you tell us what is it like in your view to participate in being a catalyst for these changes and seeing the results of your efforts?
Well, first, when they did integrate in 1949, and President Truman wrote the executive order, at that time most of us were nothing but young guys. In 1949, I was just turning 24, 25 years of age. I didn't think that I was doing anything wonderful. It was just an event that happened. I didn't think that I was paving the way. None of those thoughts really occurred to me. But as you stayed into the military, you start realizing, now wait a minute, something very, very significant has happened here. And we are doing something that no one would have ever dreamt that we would ever do. So this thing is going to impact the whole general population, which it did.
It is amazing.
There are about 3 or 4 years, everything was wonderful. People pretty much forgot about it. I can recall my first duty assignment. I had a Colonel Unruh who I was working for in the Far East Air Material Command over in Tachikawa, and I joined the command. He called me up and introduced himself, Yaki, and he said, well, Harold, he said, I'm going to be very honest with you. He says, I don't believe in what was done, but he says, this is a fact of life, but you're going to have to prove it to me that you are as good as you are supposed to be. I said, fine. You know, I thanked them. I said, thanks for being so honest with me. It was nothing but about 16, 17 months later, myself and 3 other guys were called back into Colonel Unruh's office, and he was recommending the 4 of us to be promoted to major below the zone. Well, only one of the 4 of us made it, but the very fact that he had recognized 4 of us, and I was the only Afro-American in amongst those 4 guys, the very fact that he recognized us to that extent showed how he completely changed. And from that point on, I was as good as friends as you can get with the man who is your colonel and your commander, but everything was just great from that moment on. So there was a whole complete change in people's general attitude. Once they got to know you, and they said, there's any difference. He's a pilot, I'm a pilot. What's the big deal here? Well, there was no big deal. And once they realized that, hey, you give me an assignment, and I guarantee you, I will carry out that assignment as well as you will carry out your assignment.
Wonderful.
And that's all that they asked for. Nothing more, nothing less.
Tremendous. We're getting a lot of questions from our viewers who are still listening into the broadcast and tuned into the webinar. One from Sergey English asking if we know Hiram Mann from Titusville, Florida, and I'm certain the answer on your part is yes.
Yes, I know that, mister. Know him very, very well.
We sure hope.
Matter of fact, I periodically call Hiram. I haven't talked to him in about, almost a year now, but I do periodically talk to Hiram, man. And like he said, he is down in Florida. He and his wife is now living in an assisted nursing home, assisted living nursing home. Hiram is now about, Hiram must be 90, 91, 92 years old now, because Hiram was about 4 years or so older than I was.
Yeah, he's a great guy. We've enjoyed working with him for years as well, and I certainly hope we can impose upon him to join us in a future webinar, because he's got some remarkable stories to tell as well, as do all of the Tuskegee Airmen from the remarkable experiences they've had. Another question comes from Jim Kerr asking about the ME-262 conflicts, and I know probably more of them were shot up than were shot down, but Mr. Kerr wants to know how many ME-262s were shot down.
There were 3 confirmed kills. There were, I believe, 7 or 8 damaged, and there were a couple of probables. Now, those numbers, I might be a little bit off, but that is how I remember it. But in terms of confirmed kills, there were 3 confirmed kills.
Wonderful. And I remember hearing other airmen talk about some of the strafing runs on the airfields and destroying several of them on the ground as well. So that's where the question about whether they were shot up or shot down comes from.
Yeah.
Question here comes from one of our 7-year-old viewers, listeners. Sam wants to know if the nicknames in the movie were similar to the nicknames the pilots would have had, and he adds that he's very proud of what the Tuskegee Airmen have done for our country. So thanks for your question, Sam. At 7 years old, you're showing a lot of maturity, and we'll let Harold answer the question about the nicknames.
Well, everybody has a nickname. Matter of fact, as a kid, everyone has a nickname, and things are no different. When you go in the military, you get to know good guys. They become your buddies, and either you will use the old nickname that they gave you when you were in your neighborhood, or else they'll come up with a brand new nickname for you.
And that's
everybody's got a nickname, whatever it is.
Absolutely. We're going to keep this going. If Harold, are you all right if we just keep this going for about another 20 minutes? Have you got enough left in you?
Then I do have something that I must do, although this is an awful lot of fun, but another 20 will be just great.
Fantastic. Let me know if you need to take a break, and we'll run back to our little commercial messages, if you will, and see if we can entice people to make more donations, because that's...
You go right ahead. Get that money.
Our mission is to keep this project going and keep these messages getting out to the schools and the general public, where the inspiration can really take root.
Absolutely. And we'll take all donations.
I see we have a comment from Chauncey Spencer II. I know his father is an original Tuskegee Airman, and we would love to visit with him more at future webinars about the experience that his family has had. Here's a message from Mr. Spencer. I feel that the action of the Tuskegee Airmen as a whole, as one, that they were there, that they did their part in making it a betterment in humankind as Americans, and that certainly speaks well of the commitment in the face of outrageous treatment that the Tuskegee Airmen experienced. There was another question here about how were you treated from when you returned to the U.S. and for the rest of your lives? Did you find well-paying jobs immediately? Was life difficult? So Belle Graves wants to know, how were you treated when you returned to the U.S.?
Well, the war only lasted 4 years. We had a segregated society by tradition and by law. The war lasted from 41 up until May of 1945 when Germany quit, and then the Japanese ended their war in August of 1945. So in those 4 or 5 years, you came right back to the exact same old thing. Nothing had changed whatsoever. And it was that way for, well, actually all the way up until 1964 when they passed the first civil rights law. So, so we came back from the war in 45, so it was another 19 years before they passed the civil rights of 1964.
Unbelievable. Well, we've come quite a long ways, but we certainly still have a long ways to go in bridging that great divide.
But things are so much better now.
Absolutely, and we want to keep focused on the mission and keep focused on improving the quality of life for all American citizens, and we appreciate everything that you and the Tuskegee Airmen have done in that regard. I want to mention that we have had quite a number of questions from youngsters, and it is the enthusiasm of the kids that we encounter that really drives us forward. It's remarkable to have an impact and to use the lessons of the Tuskegee Airmen in overcoming obstacles as an inspiration for youngsters of today who may be facing a lot of challenges on their own, and I think the Tuskegee Airmen have certainly set an example that can be followed for centuries to come in persevering, even under the most trying circumstances, to overcome the obstacles in front of you. And I wonder if you can reflect on that for us for a couple of minutes, Colonel Brown.
Sure. What I tell most of the kids, and I speak at a lot of places, schools, high schools, junior high, you name it. And what I impress on them is this: you can become anything that you choose to become. The only limitations that you have are your God-given talents. That's the only thing that limits you. And I say dream the most impossible dream, and then go for it. Because the opportunity is there, and if you work hard, you persevere, sure, there'll be obstacles. We all have obstacles in life. You jump the obstacles, but you just keep going. And you never give up, and you never lose sight of your goals. And you just continue doing that, and I guarantee you'll get to where you finally want to be.
And that really summarizes the focus and mission of the Red Tail Education Program, and exemplifies the example of the Tuskegee Airmen. And the driving principles between our Red Tail Education Program are to inspire kids to use your brain, never to quit, be ready to go, expect to win, and you will succeed in spite of any obstacles that you encounter. The objective being to aim high and to believe in yourself, to overcome obstacles, and to achieve your goals. So we invite. I
guarantee if they follow those rules, I'll almost guarantee success.
And on the screen, you're seeing some of the principles depicted in photos and some of the incredible young kids that we've actually had in the aircraft. And always inspiring to see the broad smiles and the bright shining faces of people who get to realize in person what it was like to sit in the state-of-the-art fighter aircraft from World War II.
That's neat.
It really is similar to in the 1940s when these aircraft were created. It was very much like being an astronaut, because you were flying the greatest technologically advanced aircraft on the planet at that time. And it must have been quite a thrill.
Well, you know what? It took 100 days from the time they put it on paper and they flew the first one, 100 days. And after they started mass producing them, they cost $100,000 a copy. Do you know what an F-35 would cost you today?
I have no idea. I know they're very, very spendy to restore it.
I mean, we are talking about millions of dollars, millions of dollars a copy. But that's what that P-51 was. 100 days to design it, $100,000 a copy.
Rod Hall writes in and asks, what other aircraft did you fly after the war?
Well, I was very, very fortunate in that after the war I came back, and after being an instructor, I was an instructor down in Tuskegee, and then I was selected to go to the Central Instrument Instructor School, and Captain McGee was one of the 5 guys that went to that school with me. And also we had First Lieutenant Chappie James, who became a 4-star general. He at that time was the first lieutenant, and he was one of the 5 guys. So it was Captain McGee, myself, Chappie James, Weldon K. Groves, and Roland Bynum were the first 5 black guys to go to the Central Instrument Instructor School, and the only 5 to do it. But in terms of airplanes, when I went overseas in '50 to FEMCOM, I went in to talk to a guy, Major Kelly, who was right across the road from me, and I was in electronics at the time. So I asked him, I said, hey, do you suppose that I could help you fly some of these airplanes? Do you ever need any help? And he says, absolutely. He said, you flew the 51. I said, yeah, I flew this during the war. So he says, why don't you fly all of the 51s, and that will release me to fly the jets. I said, okay. So I started flying the 51s. We then got in a T-33 about 6 weeks later, and he gave me a 20-minute ride in the T-33 and says, okay, you are now a jet pilot. So I then started flying F-80s, F-84s, F-86s, F-94s. I was also flight testing all of the Army aircraft would come over in crates, and we would erect them, and we'd have to flight test them and then turn them over to the Army. So I was current L5s, and L5s, L16s, L17s, L19s, and L20s. Then I was also flying the C-47 and also C-45. Now the C-47 I was flying back and forth from Japan over to Korea, and I was making 4 or 5 trips a month flying the C-47. And I can remember so well, I had a green card, and I had been an instrument pilot, and I had gone to the Central Instrument Instructor School. So every place I went, I was always an instrument check pilot. Well, when I got my green card, I had my own clearing authority. And I would get over in Korea, look out, ceiling 150, 200 feet, sign off on the clearance on myself, load up the airplane, and go. And I have flown in icy conditions. I got, and you're talking about flying experience, I really got flying experience. Then in addition to those airplanes, I flew the B-25 when I went into SAC. In SAC, you had to be triple rated. So I had to go back to school and get my navigator bombardier wings. So I was a pilot, a navigator, and a bombardier, and they called us three-headed monsters. But then I flew the B-47 in SAC, which was a 6-jet engine bomber. I had a select crew, and I was also an instructor pilot throughout my whole career in SAC. As a matter of fact, in my little bio there, I mentioned the fact that I was current throughout my career in 20 different aircraft.
Wow. That is.
So I really had a fantastic, flying career.
You had a good run at it there. That's incredible. Now, I'm going to combine a couple of the questions next, and we're going to save those for Colonel McGee, and we'll save those for Colonel McGee. When we were discussing this and doing our preparation for this broadcast, we asked Colonel McGee to reflect a little bit on these following two questions. One has to deal with the romance part of the movie, and was there any of that sort of thing actually happening? So we'll let him talk about that, as well as the depiction of the Tuskegee Airman who had a little bit of a drinking issue to control his nerves during the combat. He had some great...
I can tell you that I think I don't know of a single guy who would ever take a drink and get into an airplane. I don't know. As a matter of fact, I just refuse to believe that anybody over there would have been that stupid to get, you know, when you took off from that with that P-51, you were on that doggone Mattis runway. You had a full load of fuel, your guns, full load of ammunition, and you had 2 Wayne tanks, 75 gallons each. And I mean, you needed all of that runway. And everybody sweated the takeoff because periodically, you know, you would have 4 squadrons, 1 runway, and you got 4 taxiways, two taxiways on one end of the runway, 2 taxiways on the other end of the runway, and you're all lined up. And there's anywhere from 16 to 17 airplanes. So there you got 60-some airplanes, and they would take the lead squadron, and they would move onto the runway. And then they would start flagging them off. And if you can imagine 60-some airplanes with all those Merlin Rolls-Royce engines roaring, and guys just being flagged off, and the first mass takeoff I saw when I got overseas, what happened was this. With the lead squadron, A airplane's engine quit. He runs off of the end of the runway. A couple airplanes down, another one's engine quits. He cuts the throttle, and he goes off to the left side. It happened again. He takes the right side of the first airplane. So there you got 3 airplanes, and there's no other place to go. They had 2 more airplanes take off that lost their engine. One of them hit the airplane on the left, but there was no explosion. The next one, the 5th one that lost this engine, hit the airplane on the right, and there was a big explosion and a great big fireball down there. And I saw 5 airplanes lose their engine on takeoff. All you got to do is to witness that, and you know that you better be at your very top on takeoff. And that is the big thing that you sweated, takeoff, because you're going off heavyweight. You need every foot of runway that you could get, and there's where you sweated. And you wanted that engine to run. So I just can't imagine anybody taking a drink and flying an airplane. So that, I think, was a little, you know, they do have prerogatives. It's their movie, and they put up the $57 million, and they kind of use their prerogatives occasionally. But no one did that. Now, in terms of the romance side, I don't know. I imagine there may have been several of the guys that might have had, you know, little girlfriends that they had met. It didn't happen in my case. It didn't happen in Colonel McGee's case, I know for a fact. And then we were so busy flying, the only time we ever got off the base if we had bad weather or something, or else the whole group had a stand-down day for maintenance or something. Then you might, you know, go buzzing off with your little Jeep or, you know, a couple of the local towns or something. But you just didn't have time for that, you know. So there may have been some of it, but I'm not aware of it. But I imagine that there was, though. I mean, you know, single guys are single guys all over the world.
We're going to wrap this up pretty soon. I'm going to just take a couple of more questions, so by all means send in any other questions, and we'll try to fit them all in. The one that keeps coming up, this has been repeated several times, and in the movie, there was an aerobatic maneuver that one of the Tuskegee Airmen performed, and I think you know what I'm referring to. It's similar to what's commonly called in the air show routines these days a lumshavuk, where he actually got the airplane to do a backflip. And I'm wondering if there were any aerobatic maneuvers like that that were possible in the Mustang or any other fighter you flew.
I have never seen it.
Okay.
I have never seen
it. Maneuver in real life, you've got to go to an air show and look at an extra 300 or some other high-performance aerobatic plane, because I'm not sure that was doable unless you had speed brakes and could actually get the airplane to flip. I can't imagine.
I don't know. But you know, we did all of the standard maneuvers, you know, rolls, slow rolls, barrel rolls, you know, all that jazz. And often when the guys came down, and if they had gotten a victory, they would buzz the field, roll it a couple of times, you know. But those were all just, you know, standard maneuvers that everyone did. But the other, I don't even know if the airplane was even capable of doing it.
Rod Hall sends in a couple of questions, and perhaps you can answer them in more detail. But during your 23 years on active duty, how many hours did you accumulate? And his second part of his question is, how many Tuskegee aircraft and pilots were lost during the war? So let's start with your total hours of flight time.
I have 7,500.
7,500, very respectable.
Yeah. Well, I flew so many aircraft, and I even flew multi-engine aircraft, you know, like the C-47 or something, and then I flew that B-47 for almost 10 years. And those missions that I flew, I had an assignment over in Russia, and that was almost a 15-and-a-half-hour mission for me. So a lot of my training missions, we'd go off on a double in-flight refueling, and I would sometimes fly 15, 16-hour training mission, just setting up in that bubble.
Incredible.
So, you know, because of those airplanes, it wasn't unusual for me when I flew. I was really billing up time, you know, chunks of time, whereas many of the guys who pretty much stayed in fighters, and I think Colonel McGee spent most of his time flying fighters, a variety of them. So that's probably why his flying time. But though he had what, 6,000 hours, which is a lot of flying time.
Incredible. Absolutely incredible. Well,
what was your other question?
We really want to express our gratitude for your service to America and for your participation in this webinar broadcast, and we look forward to joining you again on February 4th, February 9th, and February 12th, if you're able to join us. And by all means, if you can reach out to Alex Jefferson and Hiram Mann and invite them to participate as well, that will take some of the pressure off you. We're going to do our very, very best to get Colonel McGee and others to get back in the loop here. We apologize sincerely for the technical difficulties.
Oh, no sweat. No sweat. Matter of fact, it was very enjoyable.
Glad you were there, and thank you so much. I'm going to sign off here a little in just a moment here, and thank everybody for joining in on this broadcast, and we'll find an opportunity for all of you to replay it for your friends and forward it to them at redtail.org. And we appreciate your participation this evening, and if you like what you saw or heard or both, by all means, please join us again.